The evening was unusually quiet in the industrial outskirts of the city. Dim streetlights flickered sporadically, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement below. Kara Davis, a 29-year-old boxing coach and part-time self-defense instructor, was pedaling her bike home after an intense training session. She was dressed in sporty attire, her lean figure slightly hunched as she navigated through the desolate streets. Kara loved her evening rides. They gave her time to reflect, to unwind after the adrenaline-filled hours in the gym. Tonight, however, the stillness of the area felt different. Not peaceful, but unsettling. As she approached the edge of an abandoned industrial park, she noticed something out of place: a police cruiser parked at the far end of the street. Its headlights were off, but the faint glow from inside the vehicle revealed the silhouette of a man. Kara's instincts kicked in. Years of teaching women how to stay vigilant in uncertain environments had trained her to notice the subtle signs of danger. She slowed down slightly, her eyes scanning for any alternative routes. But the only way forward was through the long stretch of road, and the cruiser was positioned like a predator waiting for prey. She took a deep breath, adjusted her grip on the handlebars, and told herself to stay calm. There was no reason to panic. Not yet. Officer Roy Benson sat in the patrol car, his fingers drumming impatiently on the steering wheel. It had been a frustrating day, another failed interrogation, another scolding from his superior. Benson was a man on the edge, both professionally and personally. His career had stagnated after years of what he perceived as being overlooked for promotions, and his temper had cost him the respect of his colleagues. Lately, his frustration had found a convenient outlet in exerting his authority over those who couldn't fight back. He didn't see it as abuse of power. He saw it as maintaining order in a world that, to him, seemed to be falling apart. When he spotted Kara's bike in the distance, his focus sharpened. A lone figure in this area at night, young, athletic, and, most notably, black was enough to stoke the embers of his biases. To Benson, her presence was inherently suspicious. He didn't need a reason to confront her. The mere fact that she was here was reason enough. His hand instinctively moved to the dashboard, flipping on the cruiser's spotlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating Kara like a target. Startled by the sudden light, Kara instinctively slowed her bike. Her heart rate quickened, but she forced herself to remain composed. She knew better than to show fear or uncertainty in situations like this. Fear was a trigger for predators, and Benson was radiating the energy of someone looking for a reason to assert dominance. As the cruiser pulled forward, blocking her path, Kara came to a complete stop. She remained on her bike, one foot on the ground to balance herself. The officer stepped out, his posture rigid, his hand resting on his belt, not yet on his holster, but close enough to send a message. Benson's face was a mask of condescension as he approached, the faint smirk on his lips betraying his intentions. Kara watched him closely, her years of training allowing her to read his body language like a book. This wasn't a routine interaction. He was spoiling for a fight. "Evening," Benson said curtly, his voice carrying the sharp edge of authority. "Out for a late ride, are we?" Kara nodded, keeping her tone neutral. "Just heading home. Long day at work." She hoped to diffuse the tension quickly, but Benson wasn't interested in pleasantries. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, lingering just long enough to make her uncomfortable. "You live around here?" he asked, though it was less a question and more an accusation. "I do," Kara replied, her voice steady. "About 2 miles from here." Benson tilted his head, as if considering her response, though his expression made it clear he didn't believe her. "Funny," he said, taking a step closer. Don't usually see people like you around these parts." There it was, the thinly veiled hostility, the kind that Kara had encountered too many times before. She chose her next words carefully. "I've taken this route dozens of times. Never had an issue." Benson's smirk widened, his hand shifting slightly closer to his holster. "Well, maybe you've just been lucky. This area's known for trouble, you know. Drug deals, break-ins. You wouldn't happen to be involved in anything like that, would you?" Kara's jaw tightened, but she refused to take the bait. "I'm just trying to get home, officer. If I've done something wrong, please let me know." Benson's smirk disappeared, replaced by a hard, calculating look. He didn't like her calmness. It made him feel like he wasn't in control. "Get off the bike," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Kara hesitated for a moment, considering her options. She knew she had done nothing wrong, but she also knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. Slowly, she swung her leg over the bike and stood upright, her hands visible at her sides. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice measured. "You tell me," Benson shot back, taking another step closer. "What's in the bag?" Kara glanced down at the small backpack slung over her shoulder. "Just gym clothes and a water bottle," she replied. Benson nodded toward the ground. "Drop it. Let's take a look." Kara's patience was wearing thin, but she complied, placing the bag on the ground and stepping back. Benson crouched down, unzipping it with an air of theatrical suspicion. As he rummaged through her belongings, Kara felt a surge of frustration. She knew this wasn't about the bag or anything she might be carrying. This was about power, his need to wield it, and her refusal to submit. When Benson found nothing incriminating, his irritation became palpable. He stood up, tossing the bag back toward her feet. "Well, well," he said mockingly. "Looks like you're clean, but I'm still not convinced. What are you really doing out here?" Kara met his gaze, her expression calm but defiant. "Like I said, heading home." Benson took another step forward, closing the distance between them. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "You think you're smart, don't you? Think you can talk your way out of this?" Kara didn't flinch. "I think I have the right to be here, just like anyone else." That was the breaking point. Benson's face darkened, and without warning, he reached into his patrol car and pulled out a roll of duct tape. "You want to be smart? Let's see how smart you are when you're not moving." Before Kara could react, Benson grabbed her wrist and yanked her toward the nearest streetlight. Despite her resistance, his grip was ironclad. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice rising. Benson ignored her, wrapping the tape tightly around her hands and securing her to the pole. "You want to loiter? Fine. Stay here. Let's see how long you last." As the tape constricted her movements, Kara's mind raced. She knew she had to stay calm, to think clearly. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Benson took a step back, admiring his handiwork. "There. Now you're not going anywhere." He turned back toward his cruiser, a smug grin spreading across his face. But Kara's resolve only hardened. This wasn't how her story would end. Kara Davis felt the cold bite of the duct tape as it pressed against her wrists, securing her firmly to the metal pole. She flexed her hands slightly, testing the limits of her movement, but the tape was tight. Benson had made sure of that. Her heart was racing, but her face betrayed none of her inner turmoil. Instead, she kept her breathing steady, her mind working to analyze the situation. This wasn't the first time she'd been confronted by someone attempting to dominate her, but this time was different. This wasn't a drunken bar patron trying to intimidate her during a self-defense seminar or a competitive sparring partner testing her limits. This was a man with a badge, and a gunner man who clearly believed he could do whatever he wanted without consequence. Officer Benson leaned against his patrol car, arms crossed, watching her like a predator admiring its prey. The faint smirk on his face made her stomach churn. Kara's instincts told her that this wasn't just about power, it was about humiliation. Benson wasn't looking for justice or order, he wanted to break her spirit, to make her feel powerless. But Kara wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. "You comfortable over there?" Benson called out, his voice dripping with mockery. Kara didn't respond. She knew better than to engage him. Any reaction, whether anger or fear, would only fuel his twisted sense of satisfaction. Instead, she focused on her surroundings. The street was eerily empty, the silence broken only by the occasional hum of the streetlights above. The industrial park nearby was a cluster of abandoned warehouses, their windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. No one was likely to pass through this area at this hour, which meant she was on her own for now. Benson, irritated by her lack of response, pushed himself off the car and began pacing in front of her, the soles of his boots scraping against the asphalt. "You know," he began, his tone conversational but laced with menace, "I've seen your type before. I think you're tough. Think you can talk your way out of anything. But look at you now." He gestured toward her bound hands, his smirk widening. "Not so tough when someone decides to put you in your place, huh?" Kara remained silent, her eyes fixed on him. She wasn't about to play into his game. But inside, her mind was racing. She needed to find a way to de-escalate the situation or, at the very least, buy herself some time. Her GPS watch was still active. She'd made sure to activate the distress signal earlier, though she had no way of knowing if anyone had received it. The signal was linked to her father, James Davis, a retired military instructor who had a knack for always showing up when she needed him most. If the signal had reached him, she knew he'd be on his way. But how much time did she have? And how far was Benson willing to take this? "Nothing to say?" Benson continued, his voice growing sharper. "Figures. You people never know when to quit." He stepped closer, his hand resting on the baton clipped to his belt. "Here's how this is going to work. You're going to stay right here while I decide what to do with you. Maybe I call it in, maybe I don't. Depends on how cooperative you are." Kara raised an eyebrow, finally breaking her silence. "Cooperative? You've got me taped to a pole." "What exactly do you want me to do?" "Applaud your creativity." Her tone was calm, almost bored, but the sharpness of her words cut through the air like a blade. She wasn't going to beg or plead. If Benson wanted her to grovel, he was in for a disappointment. Her response caught Benson off guard. For a moment the smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of irritation. He wasn't used to people talking back to him, especially not in situations where he held all the power or thought he did. "Watch your mouth," he snapped, his hand tightening on the baton. "I don't take kindly to disrespect." "Disrespect?" Kara shot back, her voice steady. "You're the one acting like a clown. What's the plan here, officer? You gonna keep me here all night? Or maybe you're just waiting for your ego to cool off?" Benson's face darkened, and for a moment, Kara thought he might actually strike her. But instead he took a step back, forcing a laugh that sounded more like a snarl. "You think you're funny, don't you? Well, we'll see how funny you are when this all goes on your record. Loitering, resisting arrest, obstruction of justice, you name it. By the time I'm done with you, you'll wish you'd kept that smart mouth shut." Kara didn't respond. She wasn't about to waste energy arguing with him. Instead, she focused on controlling her breathing and keeping her muscles loose. Panicking or tensing up would only make the situation worse. She shifted her weight slightly, testing the tape around her wrists again. It was strong, but not unbreakable. If she could find the right angle, she might be able to loosen it, but she needed to be patient. Rushing would only draw Benson's attention. As the tension between them grew thicker, the faint rumble of an engine broke through the silence. Benson's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he looked down the street. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the distinct hum of oversized tires. Kara felt a surge of relief and apprehension at the same time. She knew that sound. It was her father's truck, a heavily modified beast of a vehicle that he'd built for off-road adventures. But what would Benson do when he realized someone else was coming? The truck appeared at the far end of the street, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Benson straightened up, his hand moving instinctively toward his holster. "Who the hell is this?" he muttered, more to himself than to Kara. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truck rolled to a stop a few yards away, and the driver's door swung open. James Davis stepped out, his tall, broad-shouldered frame silhouetted against the headlights. He was dressed casually, but his presence was anything but casual. There was a calm intensity about him, the kind that came from years of military training and experience. His eyes scanned the scene quickly, taking in Kara's bound hands and Benson's posture. Without saying a word, he closed the door and began walking toward them. Benson squared his shoulders, trying to project authority, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Can I help you?" he called out, his tone attempting to sound firm but betraying a hint of unease. James didn't respond immediately. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze locked on Benson. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, but it carried the weight of a man who wasn't used to being ignored. "You're going to untie my daughter," he said, his words cutting through the air like a razor. "Now." Benson bristled, his hand resting on his holster. "Your daughter? Sir, I don't know who you think you are, but—" "I said," James interrupted, taking a step closer. "Untie her. Before I make you." The tension in the air was palpable, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. Benson's fingers twitched near his holster, but he didn't draw. He could see it in James's eyes, the calm, controlled focus of someone who had seen far worse than this and wasn't afraid to act. For the first time that night, Benson felt a flicker of doubt. He wasn't in control anymore, and he knew it. James Davis stood firm, his eyes fixed on Officer Benson with a cold intensity that left no room for negotiation. The streetlight above them flickered, casting uneven shadows on the cracked pavement, but James's towering presence remained unmoved. Benson's hand hovered near his holster, a visible attempt to reassert his authority, but the slight tremor in his fingers betrayed his growing unease. Kara watched the scene unfold, her wrists still bound tightly to the pole, but her heart surged with a mix of relief and adrenaline. Her father was here, and she knew one thing for certain: he wasn't leaving without her. "You've got about 5 seconds to start untying her," James said, his voice calm but filled with a restrained menace that only someone with military experience could muster. "I don't like repeating myself." Benson straightened his posture, puffing out his chest in a desperate attempt to reclaim the power he felt slipping away. "Sir, I suggest you back up," he said, his voice tinged with irritation but lacking the confidence it carried earlier. "This is a lawful detainment, and if you interfere, I'll have no choice but to arrest you as well." James took another step closer, closing the distance between them. His presence was magnetic, his eyes unwavering. "Lawful," he repeated, the word rolling off his tongue with a derisive edge. "You call this lawful?" He gestured toward Kara, his hand steady. "Binding an unarmed woman to a pole in the middle of nowhere. You're not enforcing the law, son, you're abusing it. And I don't take kindly to cowards who hide behind badges." Benson's face flushed red. his smirk now replaced by a tight-lipped scowl. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he snapped, though his voice cracked slightly at the end. He took a step back, his hand gripping the handle of his holstered gun now, as if drawing it would restore the dominance he so desperately sought. "Step back, or I will use force." Kara's voice cut through the tension, sharp and unwavering. "Dad, he's bluffing," she said, her tone deliberate. She wanted Benson to know she wasn't afraid, even if her wrists ached from the constriction of the duct tape. "He's all bark and no bite. You should have seen how fast he went for that tape instead of dealing with me like a professional." The remark hit its mark. Benson's nostrils flared, his grip on the holster tightening as his temper flared. "You want to test me?" he barked, his voice rising as he took a half step toward James, now fully gripping his gun. "I'm not afraid to." Before he could finish the sentence, James moved. It wasn't a frantic motion, but a calculated shift, the kind that came from years of combat training. His hand shot out with precision, gripping Benson's wrist before the officer could draw his weapon. The speed and force of the movement caught Benson off guard, and he stumbled slightly, his balance faltering. "You don't want to do that," James said evenly, his grip firm but controlled. His eyes bore into Benson's with an unyielding certainty, as if daring him to escalate further. "Because if you do, I'll make sure you regret it." Benson's eyes darted between James's face and his own trapped wrist, panic flashing briefly before anger took over. He twisted his arm, trying to break free, but James didn't budge. The officer was physically outmatched, and he knew it. Still, his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Let go," he hissed, his voice shaky but defiant. James held Benson's wrist for a moment longer, then released it with a sharp motion that sent the officer stumbling backward. "Fine," James said, his tone almost bored. "You want to play tough? Go ahead. But just know this, I've dealt with men far more dangerous than you. Men who didn't need a badge to prove their strength." Benson staggered, regaining his balance, and immediately stepped back toward his patrol car. His hand reached for his radio, a small, desperate move to regain control. "Dispatch," he barked into the mic, his voice hurried. "I need backup at." The radio crackled but didn't respond. Benson frowned, adjusting the settings and trying again. "Dispatch, do you copy?" Silence. He looked up, his eyes narrowing at James, who stood motionless, his arms crossed. "What did you do?" Benson demanded, his voice rising with suspicion. James tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "What did I do? You're the one playing the hero here, son. Maybe your little toy isn't as reliable as you thought." The truth was, James had activated a signal jammer built into his truck the moment he arrived. It was a device he kept from his days in the military, a tool meant for disrupting enemy communications. He hadn't planned on using it tonight, but Benson's erratic behavior left him no choice. If this officer wanted to escalate, James wasn't about to let him call for reinforcements. Benson's frustration boiled over and he turned back to James, his face now a mask of rage. "You think you're smart, don't you? You think you can just walk in here and—" "Enough," James interrupted, his voice slicing through the tirade like a blade. "You're out of your depth, kid. The smart thing to do right now is untie my daughter and walk away. Otherwise, this is only going to get worse for you." Benson hesitated, his chest heaving as his mind raced for a way to salvage the situation. He couldn't let this man undermine him, couldn't let him win. But the weight of the confrontation was pressing down on him, and the certainty in James's eyes made it clear this wasn't a fight he could win. "Fine," Benson spat, his words dripping with venom. He turned toward Kara, reaching for the duct tape around her wrists. But as he approached, he stopped, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face. "You think this is over?" he muttered, low enough that only she could hear. "This isn't over." Kara met his gaze, her expression unflinching. "Oh, it's over," she said firmly. "You just haven't figured it out yet." As Benson ripped the tape away, Kara winced slightly but held her composure. She stepped away from the pole, rubbing her wrists as she walked toward her father. James put a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his touch firm but gentle. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softening for the first time since he arrived. "I'm fine," Kara replied, her tone steady. "Thanks to you." Benson stood by his car, his hands clenched into fists as he watched the two of them. His pride was in tatters, his authority dismantled. But even now, his mind churned with thoughts of revenge. He wasn't going to let this go not without a fight. "You two better get out of here," Benson said, his voice loud and hollow. "Before I change my mind." James glanced at him, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, we're leaving," he said, turning back to Kara. "But you might want to think long and hard about what just happened here, officer. Because next time, you might not be so lucky." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Benson's face twisted with rage. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. James and Kara turned away, walking toward the truck without a backward glance. Benson stood frozen, his hands shaking as he watched them go, the weight of his humiliation pressing down on him like a stone. As Kara climbed into the passenger seat, she let out a slow breath, her body finally relaxing after the tension of the ordeal. James started the engine, the rumble of the truck filling the silence as they drove away. Kara looked over at her father, a small smile breaking through the exhaustion on her face. "You really don't mess around, do you?" she said. James glanced at her, his expression softening. "When it comes to you, never." As James's truck roared down the street, its tires crunching over gravel and broken pavement, Kara glanced back through the rearview mirror. Officer Benson's figure grew smaller and smaller in the distance, but she could still feel the weight of his glare, even as he disappeared from sight. Her wrists throbbed from the tight grip of the duct tape, and her pulse was only just beginning to settle. She leaned back in her seat, exhaling deeply, but her mind remained a whirlwind of thoughts. The adrenaline had dulled her emotions during the confrontation, but now, in the relative safety of her father's truck, the magnitude of what had just happened began to sink in. She wasn't just angry, she was livid. Livid at Benson, at the abuse of authority, and at the casual ease with which he'd tried to dehumanize her. James glanced at her from the driver's seat, his expression unreadable, but the slight furrow in his brow betrayed his concern. He was a man who rarely showed his emotions outright, but Kara had grown up learning to read the subtle tells in his demeanor. He was just as angry as she was, though he was masking it with his usual air of calm control. "You okay, kiddo?" he asked, his voice steady but softer than before. Kara nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure if it was true. "I'm fine," she replied after a beat, her voice low. "Or I will be. Just processing." James nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. He didn't push her to talk, knowing she needed space to gather her thoughts. For a while, the only sound in the truck was the low hum of the engine, a rhythmic counterpoint to the chaos that still swirled in Kara's mind. She rubbed her wrists absent-mindedly, the lingering sensation of the duct tape serving as a grim reminder of Benson's cruelty. Finally, she broke the silence. "How did you know to come?" she asked, her tone curious but tinged with weariness. "The GPS signal." James gave a small nod. "Your alert came through loud and clear," he said. "I was already close by, checking on that job site near the industrial park." When I saw the coordinates, I knew something was wrong. You don't send out an emergency signal unless it's serious. Kara let out a small, humorless laugh. Yeah, I'd say being taped to a pole qualifies as serious. She shook her head, her anger flaring again as she replayed the scene in her mind. I've dealt with plenty of jerks before, but that guy, he was something else. The way he looked at me, like I didn't even count as a person. Like I was just some object for him to control. James's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, his knuckles whitening. People like him thrive on fear, he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. They think a badge gives them the right to treat others like dirt. But what they really can't handle is someone standing up to them, someone who won't let them win. Kara nodded, her father's words resonating with her. She had stood up to Benson, even in the face of his threats, and she took some comfort in that. But the thought of how easily the situation could have gone even further haunted her. If James hadn't arrived when he did, she pushed the thought away, unwilling to dwell on what-ifs. The truck turned onto a quieter road, the industrial buildings giving way to rows of dimly lit houses. James slowed the vehicle, his eyes scanning the area with the vigilance of a man who'd spent years navigating dangerous situations. We're not going straight home, he said suddenly, breaking Kara's train of thought. Not yet. She turned to him, her brow furrowing. Why not? Where are we going? To get ahead of this, James replied, his tone matter-of-fact. That cop Benson, he's not going to let this go. You humiliated him by not folding under pressure, and men like him don't take that lightly. He'll twist the story, make it seem like you were the aggressor, or worse. I'm not giving him the chance to dig his claws in first. Kara frowned, her stomach twisting at the thought. She'd seen it happen before, how quickly the narrative could shift to paint the victim as the villain. What do you have in mind? She asked. James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled into the parking lot of a small, nondescript building tucked away at the edge of the neighborhood. The sign above the door read Veterans Resource Center. Kara recognized it. It was one of the places James frequented to meet with his old military buddies. He parked the truck and killed the engine, turning to face her fully for the first time. There's someone here I need you to meet, he said. Before she could ask who, the door to the building opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s stepped out. He was dressed in a plain button-down shirt and jeans, but his posture and bearing were unmistakably military. His piercing gaze swept over the truck, locking onto James with a look of familiarity and respect. Kara watched as her father stepped out of the truck, exchanging a firm handshake with the man. Their interaction was brief but purposeful, and a moment later James gestured for Kara to join them. Reluctantly, she climbed out of the truck, her muscles stiff from tension. As she approached, the man's sharp eyes studied her, taking in her disheveled appearance and the faint marks on her wrists. This her? He asked James, his voice low but steady. James nodded. Kara, this is Marcus Shaw. We served together back in the day. He's got connections, the kind that might come in handy right now. Kara hesitated, unsure of what to say. Marcus extended a hand, his grip firm but not overbearing. Your dad tells me you had a rough night, he said. I'm sorry you had to go through that, but we're going to make sure it doesn't go any further. She glanced at James, then back at Marcus, her skepticism evident. And how exactly are you going to do that? Marcus's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Let's just say Benson isn't the only one who knows how to throw his weight around. Difference is, we know how to do it without crossing the line. James stepped in, his voice taking on a reassuring tone. Marcus has contacts in the department, people who don't take kindly to officers like Benson tarnishing the badge. He'll make sure the right people hear about this before Benson can spin his story. Kara crossed her arms, still processing the turn of events. And what if Benson tries something anyway? She asked, her voice laced with doubt. Guys like him don't just roll over. That's why we're not stopping here, Marcus said. We'll get ahead of it, but we'll also make sure you're ready if he tries to push back. Your dad tells me you're a fighter. Good, because you're going to need that strength in the days ahead. The words settled heavily in Kara's chest, but she nodded. She wasn't about to back down, not now, not ever. As Marcus led them inside the resource center to lay out the next steps, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Benson might have tried to break her, but he hadn't counted on one thing. She wasn't fighting this battle alone. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the Veterans Resource Center as Kara paced back and forth near the entrance. Her hands still ached from the rough duct tape, though the physical pain was now secondary to the storm brewing inside her. She had listened as her father and Marcus laid out their plan to counter Officer Benson's inevitable attempts to distort the truth, but none of it had done much to calm her simmering anger. Marcus's connections in the police force, while helpful, didn't erase the humiliation she had endured or the audacity of Benson's actions. Her mind kept replaying the moment she was bound to that pole, the smug expression on Benson's face, his condescension and power trip. Each time the memory surfaced, it burned a little hotter. James watched his daughter from across the room, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He had seen that kind of pacing before, restlessness masking a deeper frustration. He knew Kara wasn't just upset. She was trying to process the helplessness she'd felt and turn it into something she could control. She had inherited his stubbornness, his unwillingness to let someone else dictate the terms of her life, and now that fire burned in her every movement. He stepped closer, leaning casually against the wall but keeping his tone calm and measured. "You're wearing a hole in the floor, kid," he said. "What's on your mind?" Kara stopped mid-stride, turning to face him. Her face was set, her jaw tight. "What's on my mind?" she repeated, her voice sharp. "What's on my mind is that a man like that is still out there, walking around like he owns the world. And we're in here talking about filing reports and making polite phone calls." James didn't flinch at her tone. Instead, he nodded, letting her vent. "You're not wrong," he said, "but rushing back out there without a plan doesn't do us any good. Benson's the kind of guy who thrives on people making impulsive moves. He's waiting for you to make a mistake. That's the problem," Kara snapped. "We're always waiting for the system to work, waiting for people like him to face consequences. But what if it doesn't? What if he gets away with it like so many others?" Marcus stepped into the conversation, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "It's not about waiting," he said firmly. "It's about playing the long game. You hit someone like Benson where it hurts not just his ego, but his career. That takes patience." Kara shook her head, frustrated. Patience isn't going to stop him from doing this to someone else. He already thinks he's untouchable. James pushed off the wall, stepping closer. His voice softened, but there was an edge of steel beneath it. "And that's exactly why we don't play by his rules. We don't let his arrogance drag us into a fight we're not ready for. You taught self-defense, Kara. What's the first rule?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she answered. "Control the situation." "Exactly," James said. "And right now that means staying smart. Benson's not going to back off, not after what happened tonight. He's going to come after you one way or another. But when he does, we'll be ready." Before Kara could respond, the faint rumble of an engine outside broke the quiet of the room. All three of them turned toward the door, instinct sharpening. James moved first, his military training kicking in as he stepped toward the window and peered outside. His jaw tightened. "Speak of the devil," he muttered. Kara's heart leapt into her throat as she moved to the window beside him. Parked outside was Benson's patrol car, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The officer himself was leaning against the driver's side door, his arms crossed, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his face. He looked completely unbothered, as though the earlier confrontation had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. But there was something predatory in his posture, a subtle threat in the way he carried himself. "What the hell is he doing here?" Kara asked, her voice low but seething with anger. Marcus moved toward the door, his expression grim. "He's trying to send a message," he said. "He wants you to know he's not afraid to come after you, no matter where you are." James placed a hand on Kara's shoulder, grounding her. "Stay inside," he said firmly. "Let me handle this." But Kara shook her head, her resolve hardening. "No," she said, "I'm not hiding. Not from him." James studied her for a moment, then gave a reluctant nod. "Fine, but let me do the talking." The three of them stepped outside, the cool night air biting at their skin. Benson straightened as they approached, his smirk widening. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Nice place," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You didn't think I'd find you hiding out here?" Kara clenched her fists, but James spoke first, his voice calm but firm. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here," he said. "What do you want?" Benson chuckled, the sound low and mocking. "What do I want? Oh, just making sure everything's above board. You know, checking in. Thought it was a little suspicious you driving off like that without saying goodbye." "You mean after you unlawfully detained my daughter?" James shot back, his tone cold. Benson's smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. "Unlawful," he repeated, feigning innocence. "I was just doing my job. She was the one acting suspicious. And as for that little stunt you pulled with the radio signal, well, let's just say I'm not letting that slide." James took a step closer, his presence looming. "You really want to push this, son? Because I guarantee you're not ready for the kind of trouble you're asking for." For a moment, Benson hesitated, the confidence in his posture wavering. But then he straightened, doubling down. "You think you scare me?" he sneered. "I don't care who you are or what you think you're going to do. People like you don't win." Kara couldn't hold back any longer. She stepped forward, her voice sharp and unwavering. "People like us?" she repeated, her eyes narrowing. "You mean people who don't roll over and let you abuse your power? You're right. We don't back down." Benson's gaze snapped to her, his smirk twisting into a sneer. "Careful," he said. "You're already on thin ice." James placed a protective hand on Kara's arm, gently pulling her back. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but commanding. "This isn't the place." Benson took a step forward, emboldened by Kara's outburst. "Oh, but I think it is," he said. "You want to play the victim? Fine. But don't think for a second that I won't come after you if you step out of line again. This isn't over." James's eyes darkened, his patience wearing thin. He took one last step, now standing toe-to-toe with Benson. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You think you're untouchable," he said, "but I promise you your time is coming. And when it does, you'll realize just how wrong you were." The tension was electric, the air between them charged with unspoken threats. For a moment, neither man moved, the weight of their confrontation hanging heavy. Finally, Benson scoffed, stepping back toward his car. "We'll see about that," he said, his smirk returning. "You can't watch your back forever." He climbed into his patrol car, the engine growling to life as he drove off into the night. Kara exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. James placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip steady. "This isn't over," he said, echoing Benson's words. "But we'll be ready." As the hours ticked by, the tension in the air grew thicker. Kara sat in the corner of the Veterans Resource Center, her mind racing with the events of the past few hours. Every nerve in her body was on edge, and despite her father's reassurances, she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was about to happen. Benson wasn't the kind of man to let go of a perceived insult, and his smug parting words echoed in her mind like a warning. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to suppress the anger bubbling inside her. James and Marcus stood by the door, speaking in hushed tones. From their expressions and body language, it was clear they were making contingency plans, strategizing for the inevitable fallout. Kara had always admired her father's ability to stay calm under pressure, but tonight even he seemed more tense than usual. His jaw was set, his posture rigid, and the occasional glance he cast toward her carried a mixture of concern and determination. Suddenly, the silence of the night was shattered by the unmistakable roar of engines. Not one, but several vehicles were approaching, their headlights cutting through the darkness like predatory eyes. Kara shot to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest as she exchanged a glance with her father. "He's back," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. James moved to the window, peering outside. His lips pressed into a thin line as he counted the cars. 3 patrol vehicles had pulled into the parking lot, their engines idling as figures emerged from each one. Benson was the first to step out, his cocky swagger unmistakable even from a distance. Behind him, several other officers followed, their expressions hard and unreadable. It was clear they weren't here for a friendly chat. Marcus joined James at the window, his brow furrowing. "He's brought reinforcements," he muttered. "This isn't just about intimidation anymore. He's trying to make a statement." Kara's stomach twisted, but she refused to let fear take hold. "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice firm. James turned to her, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp. "We stand our ground," he said, "but we don't give them an excuse to escalate. Let me handle this." Before Kara could protest, James opened the door and stepped outside, his presence commanding as always. Marcus followed, his broad frame a silent show of solidarity. Kara hesitated for a moment, then squared her shoulders and joined them. She wasn't about to let her father face this alone. Benson's smirk widened as they approached, his hands resting casually on his hips. "Well, well," he drawled, his tone dripping with mockery. "Looks like the gang's all here." James stopped a few paces away, his stance calm but unyielding. "What do you want, Benson?" he asked, his voice low and measured. "This is harassment, and you know it." "Harassment?" Benson repeated, feigning offense. "I'm just doing my job. See, I got a call about some suspicious activity in the area. I thought I'd swing by and check it out. Imagine my surprise when I found you 3 here, looking all cozy." Kara's fists clenched at his words, but James placed a calming hand on her shoulder. "Cut the crap," he said, his voice hardening. "We both know why you're here, so why don't you save us all some time and get to the point?" Benson's smirk faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered, his expression twisting into something more menacing. "The point," he said slowly, stepping closer, "is that you and your daughter seem to think you're above the law. I'm here to remind you that you're not." James didn't flinch, his gaze steady. "If you think you can intimidate us into backing down, you're wasting your time. You've already crossed the line once tonight. Don't make it worse for yourself." Benson's eyes narrowed, his hand drifting toward his holster in a calculated display of power. The officers behind him shifted slightly, their postures tense but ready. It was clear that Benson was counting on their presence to tip the scales in his favor. He wanted to provoke a reaction, to create a situation where he could justify whatever came next. "You think you can lecture me about crossing lines?" Benson sneered. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Before James could respond, Kara stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "No, you don't know who you're dealing with," she said, her tone sharp and unwavering. "You think that badge makes you untouchable, but it doesn't. You're just a bully hiding behind authority, and we're not afraid of you." Benson's face darkened, his smirk replaced by a scowl. He took another step forward, now standing just a few feet from Kara. "You've got a big mouth," he said coldly. "Maybe it's time someone shut it." James moved instinctively, stepping between Kara and Benson, his broad frame acting as a shield. "You take one more step toward my daughter," he said, his voice low and lethal, "and I'll make sure you regret it." The two men locked eyes, the tension between them crackling like electricity. For a moment it seemed as though time had stopped, the world narrowing down to the standoff between them. Then, without warning, Benson lunged, his hand going for James's shoulder in aggressive attempt to assert dominance. But James was faster. Years of military training kicked in as he sidestepped the attack, grabbing Benson's arm and twisting it with practiced precision. The officer let out a grunt of pain as he was forced to his knees, his other hand flailing toward his holster. Kara moved quickly, stepping forward and kicking the weapon out of reach before he could grab it. The other officers reacted immediately, drawing their weapons and shouting commands. But Marcus raised his hands in a calming gesture. "Nobody needs to get hurt," he said, his voice firm but composed. "Let's all take a step back and think this through." Benson struggled against James's grip, his face red with rage. "You're making a big mistake," he spat. "You think you can get away with this?" James leaned in close, his voice a dangerous whisper. "The only mistake here is you thinking you could come after my daughter and walk away unscathed." He released Benson with a sharp shove, sending the officer stumbling backward. Kara watched as Benson scrambled to his feet, his composure shattered. His eyes darted between James, Marcus, and Kara, calculating his next move, but it was clear he had lost the upper hand. For a long moment, nobody moved. The officers behind Benson exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence shaken by the turn of events. Finally, Benson straightened, brushing off his uniform as he glared at James. "This isn't over," he growled, his voice filled with venom. "You'll pay for this." James didn't respond. He simply stood there, his presence unyielding as he watched Benson retreat to his car. The other officers followed, their movements hesitant as they climbed back into their vehicles. The sound of engines starting filled the air, and within moments the parking lot was empty once again. Kara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her shoulders sagging slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. James turned to her, his expression softening as he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, her voice steady despite the exhaustion creeping in. "Yeah, thanks to you." James gave her a small, reassuring smile, but his eyes remained watchful, scanning the darkness as though expecting Benson to return. "This isn't over," he said quietly, "but we'll be ready." The quiet hum of James's truck filled the silence as he, Kara, and Marcus drove away from the Veterans Resource Center. The events of the night weighed heavily on them, the tension lingering like an unwelcome guest. Kara stared out the window, her reflection barely visible in the darkness outside. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers absent-mindedly rubbing the tender skin on her wrists where the duct tape had bitten in hours earlier. Though her father's presence had brought her a sense of security, her thoughts churned with unresolved anger and exhaustion. James glanced at her briefly, his sharp eyes catching the way her shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of the night evident in her posture. "You did good back there," he said, his voice low but steady. "Standing your ground like that. You didn't let him break you." Kara turned her head toward him, her lips curling into a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I didn't feel strong," she admitted after a moment. "I felt trapped, helpless." Her voice wavered, and she clenched her jaw to steady it. "And he loved every second of it. Guys like Benson, they don't stop until they crush people." James tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening. "People like him are bullies," he said firmly. "They thrive on fear and control. But the moment you take that away, they unravel. That's what we did tonight. We showed him that he doesn't own you." "But he's not finished," Kara countered, her voice sharpening. "You saw the look on his face when he left. He's not going to let this go." "That's why we stay ready," Marcus interjected from the back seat. His deep voice carried the calm authority of someone who had faced countless battles, both literal and figurative. "Benson's dangerous because he's desperate. He knows he crossed a line tonight, and his only way out is to try to flip the narrative. But we've got something he doesn't to each other." Kara looked over her shoulder at Marcus, her brow furrowing slightly. "And what happens when his desperation gets someone hurt? Or worse?" Marcus held her gaze, his expression resolute. "Then we make sure he's held accountable. The right way." James pulled into the driveway of their family home, the tires crunching softly over the gravel. The house stood silent and dark, a stark contrast to the chaos of the night. As the three of them climbed out of the truck, the cool night air wrapped around them, carrying the faint scent of pine from the woods nearby. Kara paused at the edge of the driveway, taking a deep breath as she tried to ground herself. James noticed and waited, giving her the space she needed. Inside, the house was quiet, the familiar comfort of its walls doing little to ease the tension that clung to Kara like a second skin. James flicked on a light, the warm glow spilling into the living room as Marcus settled into a chair by the window, keeping an eye on the street outside. Kara sat on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she stared at the floor, lost in thought. James took a seat across from her, leaning forward slightly. "Talk to me, kiddo," he said gently. "What's going on in that head of yours?" Kara hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "I can't stop thinking about what could have happened," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you hadn't shown up when you did, if Benson had gone further," she trailed off, her throat tightening. "I thought I was prepared for anything, but tonight showed me how wrong I was." James reached out, placing a steady hand on her knee. "You were prepared," he said firmly. "You stayed calm, you thought on your feet, and you didn't let him intimidate you. That's more than most people would have managed in your situation." "But it wasn't enough," Kara said, her voice rising slightly. "I still ended up tied to a pole, Dad. I couldn't stop him." "You couldn't stop him alone," James corrected, his tone gentle but insistent. "That's why we're here. Why we've always got each other's backs. No one fights these battles on their own, Kara." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I hate that it has to be a battle at all," she said, her voice trembling. "That we have to fight just to exist, just to be treated like human beings." James's jaw tightened, his own frustration simmering beneath the surface. "I know," he said quietly, "and it's not fair. But every time we stand up to people like Benson, every time we refuse to let them win, we chip away at their power. It's not easy, and it's not fast, but it's how change happens." Marcus cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "Speaking of Benson," he said, his tone serious, "I made a few calls on the way over here. Turns out tonight wasn't the first time he's pulled something like this. There are complaints against him enough to build a case if we push hard enough." Kara straightened, a spark of determination flickering in her eyes. "What kind of complaints?" she asked. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Excessive force, harassment, abuse of authority. A pattern of targeting people who can't fight back or who he thinks can't fight back." "So we use that," James said, his voice steady. "We put the spotlight on him before he can spin this into something else. If he wants a fight, he's got one." Kara nodded slowly, her resolve solidifying. "I'm not letting him get away with this," she said. "Not just for me, but for everyone he's hurt." James smiled faintly, pride glinting in his eyes. "That's my girl." The hours stretched on as they worked together, compiling evidence, drafting statements, and reaching out to Marcus's contacts. Kara's exhaustion was replaced by a fierce determination, each step bringing her closer to reclaiming the power Benson had tried to strip from her. By the time the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready. As the morning light poured through the windows, Kara stood by the kitchen counter, sipping a cup of coffee and watching the world wake up outside. James joined her, his own mug in hand. For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of the night still hanging between them. "You're stronger than you think, Kara," James said finally, his voice soft but certain. "Don't ever forget that." She looked at him, her lips curving into a small but genuine smile. "I won't," she said, "because I've got you to remind me." James chuckled, clinking his mug against hers. "Damn right you do." Outside, the world carried on, oblivious to the storm that had raged just hours earlier. But inside the house, there was a quiet sense of victory. Benson might still be out there, but so was Kara, and she wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever.